Welcome to our monthly meeting of the New York City Neighborhood Naturalist Group. My name is Lea Johnson, and I'm a doctoral student at the New York Botanical Garden and a graduate fellow with the New York City EcoFlora project. The New York Botanical Garden created the New York City EcoFlora project in 2017 with a grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Building on the garden's historical strength in collections with emerging technologies, opportunities in digital technology, the EcoFlora is a community science project to document the wild flora of New York City. To date, nearly 25,000 observers have made over 700,000 observations of plants and their biotic partners throughout New York City. You can explore these observations on our project page on iNaturalist, which I'll link in the chat in a second. Each month, we also sponsor an EcoQuest challenge, which encourages New Yorkers to observe a particular species or genus and their ecological partners, and post those onto iNaturalist. The EcoQuest for April is Map Maple. So we're looking for different species of maple. And on that page, we also have a guide to the native and introduced species of maple that you can find in New York City to help you out. Put those links in the chat just now. So this afternoon / evening, we have Dr. Lea Johnson, the Associate Director of Land Stewardship and Ecology at Longwood Gardens, here with us to present talk Urban Biodiversity, Conservation and Restoration in Complex Social-Ecological Systems. As the Associate Director of the Land Stewardship and Ecology at Longwood Gardens, Lea combines scientific research in plant ecology and ecological restoration with land management. She directs a multidisciplinary team that integrates ecology, plant science, landscape architecture, wildlife biology, and horticulture to steward 750 acres of diverse habitats in a dynamic and urbanizing landscape. Under her direction, the Land Stewardship and Ecology program conducts long-term ecological research in forests, wetlands, riparian corridors, meadows, and agricultural lands. They also develop and test best practices in land stewardship and manage more than 100 acres of public-facing native meadows and forests, highlighting the beauty and value of native plants. In our talk tonight, Lea will explore different perspectives on urban biodiversity, use the urban forest patch as a way to understand the complex social ecological dynamics of urban ecosystems, look at outcomes of ecological restoration in New York City parks in light of some of these complexities, and discuss ways to conserve and restore biodiversity in cities. So please feel free to enter any questions or comments into the chat during or after the talk. And at the conclusion, we'll go through as many questions as we're able. Also, if you're unable to stay for the whole talk, or you would like to share this talk with others, we will have a recording that will be posted onto our YouTube page, where you can also find recordings of our other recent talks. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Lea.
Thank you for that nice introduction. I suppose I should start sharing my screen. Let's see. So I won't introduce myself further because Lydia did a fine job at that. I work at Longwood Gardens, which is a place that some of you might be familiar with. Breathtaking formal gardens, our main fountain garden, or maybe you've been to the conservatories, or many people come at Christmas time. There's a big Christmas time display, but a lot of people are unaware that we have 750 acres of natural areas at Longwood that are surrounding the formal gardens. So we have these 750 acres of natural lands that are forests, fields, wetlands, meadows, variety of habitats. And for me, this is a very exciting thing because it's kind of a microcosm of the Mid-Atlantic region in terms of past land uses and current habitats and legacies in the soil, and a whole lot of similarity to places like large parks in New York City, where I've also done a bunch of work. So I have to do both anyway. Sorry. So I'm going to talk about a few things today, which Lydia went over. And at first want to start with sort of thinking about how the way that people think about biodiversity in cities and why that's important. I think of this as a continuum between the idea that nature is elsewhere, that nature is outside the city, and then the sort of other end of the spectrum where people become very aware of that there is, nature all around us in the city, and that even weeds can be wonderful. There we go. And so there's sort of a continuum between these two poles. So on one hand, on the one end of this perspective, where nature is envisioned to be something that is completely elsewhere from the city, from the built environment, those kinds of that kind of feeling can be built from visiting places that are more wild in childhood or as an adult. This perspective often is one that is aware of the destruction of natural habitats and the decreasing abundance of wild places. And I think it's a really valuable type of perspective as well, because this is the type of perspective that causes us to value really big and really wild places that are far away, and it encourages us to care about those places and to support work to preserve them and protect them and restore them. So neither of this is it's sort of a spectrum of perspectives, but all along the spectrum are valuable insights that I think can be learned from. On the other end, and in this book chapter that the figure here comes from, I called it the post-wild world, sort of after Emma Mars's way of putting it in her book. But I think I've settled more on thinking about it as the wonderful weeds perspective, where people become aware of the wonder of biodiversity in cities and begin to see it all around them. And I think it is one of the most amazing experiences if you have not noticed nature in cities to become aware of it. And I know for myself as a young person, when I started seeing the remnants of shortgrass prairie in vacant lots in Albuquerque, where enough organic matter had accumulated against the chain link fence, that was very exciting to me. And so this perspective has been very valuable for me, and it probably fueled my desire to become an urban ecologist, but and also my interest in ecological restoration. So there's sort of a feeling of abundance and a hopefulness about this perspective that I think is really, really helpful. Each of these perspectives kind of has limitations as well, though. If you are looking only at nature as something elsewhere, you can overlook biodiversity in the places where people live and work. And the places where people live and work are increasingly taking up a large fraction of, the land surface of the planet. So it's important that we also pay attention to biodiversity in these spaces that we live in, we work in, and also that we use for a variety of purposes. The embrace of biodiversity in cities and the wonder of noticing nature all around you is very valuable. And at the same time, the danger with that perspective is that you can it's possible to accept a shifted baseline, that to overlook that there are possibilities for continuing the biodiversity that maybe once was in a place that is not there now, and might take emphasis off of protecting and restoring places that have value that are outside of that immediate context. So I think there are things to learn from both of those perspectives, and I think there are many people who are sort of inhabiting a zone in the middle where people are grappling with, the pros and cons of the idea of novel ecosystems, and people are grappling with, what does ecological restoration mean in a city, and how would we go about doing that, and how do we go about doing that, and how do we evaluate what we're doing? So that's kind of the zone that I inhabit in my work. I have spent a lot of my time over the last couple of decades thinking about urban forest patches, which are really inherently a social ecological system. So it's probably good to start with a little bit of definition when talking about something like an urban forest patch. There's a lot of exciting work going on in the realm of urban forestry and urban forests that is focused on all the tree canopy in a city. And what I'm talking about when I talk about urban forest patches is not all the trees that occur in a city, but places where people interact with the plants, with all of the other biota, and the abiotic components of that environment as a social ecological system. This is where my two screens is getting real weird. I'm just gonna look over here. Pardon me if I'm not looking at you for a second. It's a place where trees grow spontaneously when the land is not managed. So for example, not in a desert where every single tree would have to be watered. It's a place that has spontaneously regenerating and predominantly self-organizing vegetation, as opposed to something more designed or planted with other values in mind. It's a dynamic system in a matrix of urban and other land uses, where there are flows that connect that forest patch to the landscape, species, materials, energy. It's a place where forest regeneration can happen, and so an urban forest patch is a little bit different from a park where all of the ground underneath the trees is mowed, because that prevents regeneration of forest species, or trees that are growing in concrete, for example. It's a system that supports ecological processes and complexity in ecosystem functions, and it might follow different trajectories of vegetation succession or dynamics following a disturbance. It may contain species that are characteristic of regional forests, as well as species that are introduced either intentionally or unintentionally. And there are many of those. It can be found across all kinds of different land ownership and boundaries, and that can really be very important to how these forest patches are managed and to the differences between them. There may be many different types of management or uses of land in urban forest patches, and they can have very different histories and surrounding landscape contexts. So that's what we're talking about when, or at least that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about urban forest patches. So I've been working with a group of people, and I'll show them in a couple of slides down, but I've been working with a group of people through the National Socio-Ecological Synthesis Center in Annapolis. We've gotten together people from 4 different big urban areas and beyond, and we have been working together to think about urban forest patches as social ecological systems. And this is a diagram from a paper that we wrote recently that helps to envision some of the relationships that happen to create an urban forest patch, and it's as an assemblage of all kinds of living things in relationship to the non-living environment. And so you have both large-scale social drivers, things like technology and knowledge and political regimes and economic cycles on one hand, interacting with very large-scale biophysical drivers like the atmosphere, the underlying geology, the nutrients that are there, precipitation, those kinds of things, temperature. And you have legacies of the past of all of those things that interact. Within those bigger scale drivers interact with smaller scale ones. People such as, and these are in these little boxes, examples, people such as those who actually visit a forest or who are neighbors to it, or who have opinions about it, or who might vote on it. The condition of the forest patch as it is right now, the biodiversity that is there, the structural complexity, the regeneration of the forest itself, interacting, both indirectly and directly with, local biophysical factors, like how big is the forest patch and how much edge does it have and what is at the edge and what species are there and how did they get there and how are they interacting with one another. The larger scale configuration of the landscape, how connected is it with other forest patches, which is turning out to be kind of important. How is it affected? How is the value of land affected by regional economies and changes in that environment, and how does that affect how much forest there is, and how people value it? And all of this is connected with multi-level networks of governance, and here not just government, but the ways that people organize to govern. So when we think about urban forest patches, it's very easy to think about trees, but there's a lot more to it. And it's also it also exists in a in both spatial and temporal context. So in both space and time, these things are changing, and this is I think part of the fun of ecology is that it's always in this constant multiple directions of change. So, and you can look at it at multiple scales. So when we try to understand the condition of a forest patch, we're looking at a place that has been through many, many changes in the past. And frustratingly, for those of us who are trying to understand how things have gotten to be exactly how they are right now, and how that might influence the future, there's often not like very detailed records on exactly what happened in any given place, even where people have been for quite a while. So, and you have interactions at multiple levels of scale that affect what is happening in a place right now. So this is the group that I've been working with. It's a sing. There they are. And we have been working on a project for the past few years where we're putting together information from forest patches in 4 major metropolitan regions. And we're interested in understanding the influence on the composition, structure, heterogeneity of forest patch vegetation. So that, the forest itself, all of that, all of those plants. And we're interested in understanding how urbanization and ownership and governance interact to influence those things. So we have been looking at forest patches. So this is just an illustration. There's a forest patch on the edge of Philadelphia, and next to the airport. And we have been looking at places where vegetation plots have been established and sampled within those forest patches. So detailed information describing the forest plant community. And then we're looking at that in relationship to a 1 kilometer buffer of what is immediately surrounding that forest patch. The data set that we're working with, it's taken us quite a while to put together. It's a very large data set. And it currently has nearly 5,000 plots from 4 different regions, combining data from 19 different studies. So we're just in the sort of early phases of getting very into the results of this, but in order to do this kind of work, it requires some very interesting tools for putting data together. So we looked at places where we could get data that was actually collected in a forest patch, and where all the trees were measured. We looked at national scale data. So we're using three different national scale data sets, as well as a whole bunch of regional, city scale, and local scale studies. We had to standardize all of this data, which those of you who work with plants, you know about the Latin names and how they sometimes change. And when you're working with data sets that are decades old, you can certainly need to do some sorting out of that. And then we summarize those. We're just about starting to work on the other strata of the forest. So working with these buffers around the individual, each of those 4,905 plots. Each of them we've looked at the context and the canopy. We found 105 tree species, and interestingly, on average, they're about 80% native. And this is something that we've seen in a number of different studies, stuff that I've worked on, stuff that other people in this group have worked on. And we've also found that that the tree species change along a gradient of impervious surface. And so we see some species. I won't go into all the details about how to interpret this type of diagram, but we'll finish the paper soon, and then you can read all the details if you want to. But what we found is that some species decrease as impervious surface increases, while others increase. The species declining at low levels of urbanization are native species. There are more species declining than increasing, and that many species are increasing and decreasing at actually pretty low levels of impervious cover. So in the zone of like up to 10%. So even those lower levels of impervious cover can have an effect. Species that increase at higher levels of urbanization are things that you could call weedy root walls. They're species that take advantage of highly disturbed of soil conditions. So, you know, following a major ecological disturbance, very common in highly built up areas. We're very good at using bulldozers as humanity. And then also commonly planted street trees become more common in the forest. In terms of looking at communities, the decreasing species change the most at just 0 to 10% impervious cover. Increasing species also change in that zone, but there's less of a clear pattern. So interestingly, you know, species that were increasing at higher levels of urbanization were primarily, but not entirely, non-native. And they also included native species that can take advantage of those early post-disturbance kinds of situations. So this is just one it's the first in a series of analyses that we're doing, and hopefully this is a map of some of our plots here. Well, our plots, the plots that are included. We did not go out and sample all of these ourselves, although we did sample some of them, depending on who you're talking to in the group. But we're looking forward to learning more from this data set so that we can help to inform decision-making at a large scale. Another related study that I've been working on recently looks at effects, look at the effects of multiple stressors on forest patches, particularly in riparian areas, so along rivers and streams. Riparian forests are really important for water quality. And so this study looked at the influence of potential climate change, using forecast modeling, invasive species, which we measured, and urbanization, looking at land cover similarly to the previous study that I talked about. And then looking at the condition of forest patches. We looked at 100 forest patches along the Delaware and Chesapeake Bays. These are, this is obviously a pretty urbanized region. And we looked at urban forest patches that were in that were adjacent to urban land use in municipalities of very, very different size along a gradient from very small to very large. Working with a colleague at Shippensburg, Claire Jantz, we were able to model, and a couple of other folks, we were able to model, where urban forest patches would be inundated under various different scenarios of storm surge and sea level rise. And what we found was that most forest patches are adjacent to urban land in the region, and that flooding would affect somewhere between 8 and 19% of regional forests, which is actually quite a bit under the different scenarios. We measured plant community composition in these 100 forests, and we found non-native invasive plants in 94% of them. There were non-native invasive vines in more than 80%, which can have a strong effect on tree regeneration. 80% of the plots had woody vines covering trees. Trees were mostly native, but as in the other study, but shrubs were more than half invasive species. And we're finding this in the mid-Atlantic region and elsewhere, that it's really in the shrub layer that we're seeing a lot of a much greater abundance of non-native plants. The ecological disturbances that we were able to observe in these plants were mostly of directly obvious human interventions. Interestingly, nearby agriculture also really influenced the diversity of invasive plants. So I think it's interesting and important to remember that that urbanization is not the only human land use that causes strong changes in plant communities. So we did find all three of these things with potentially strong effects on plant communities in urban forest patches along streams and rivers. So we've talked a little bit about thinking about biodiversity in general, about urban forest patches. So we've sort of outlined some of the issues, some of the challenges for management. So next I want to talk a little bit about work that I've done in collaboration with the New York City Parks Natural Resources Group over the years. And to put that in context, it's become pretty well known that human actions change urban plant communities. This is some work from Berlin by Ingo Kabarek, where looking at, he has an index, which, ecology is full of words and German ecologists make up even more words, an index of heteroby, which is a level of man-made disturbance. And the number of native species, as you can see, decreases with level of man-made disturbance. Well, in Europe, they actually differentiate between archaeophytes and neophytes because they have species that were introduced a very long time ago that they're aware of that, and then species that were introduced mainly from the Americas in more recent time. But similar trends have been found here. So percent of, this one shows percent of introduced species increasing along that same disturbance gradient in different kinds of plant communities. So another useful way to look at how plant communities are assembled in urban environments is this concept of filters. Where there are many species that could potentially be in a place, and that they are filtered by a series of conditions that limit some species from being there. So if they can't get there, if there was an event that removed them, if people prefer them because they are pretty, all of these things can increase or decrease the likelihood that you're going to find a given plant in a given place. I think it's also really helpful to think about all of this in context of the process of biological invasion, since so much of when we think about urban forest patches, we're we're often looking at the native flora in relationship to not just introduced species, but species that are particularly invasive, that cause major change in the system. And so when we think about invasive species, it can be very easy to think, oh, they're just bad, bad species. Many species are transported by people from one place to another on the planet. And when they are transported, most of them die, especially the accidental introductions. Many of them die along the way, but some of them arrive alive. And then of those that arrive alive, many of those fail to reproduce, or they fail to survive after they get there. Others, a much smaller number, are able to become established. They reproduce and start a new population. Of those, most will fail to spread beyond the point of introduction, although some can spread and start populations in new locations. The impact that a species has is determined by, there we go, whether or not this process keeps going over and over again, and that species keeps spreading. And also whether or not that species has a measurable or noticeable impact. And it's worth mentioning that human perception is very much involved in this, in the concept of impact. So I've been collaborating since, I think, about 2006 with the Natural Resources Group of the New York City Parks Department, to take a look at long-term outcomes of ecological restoration, specifically addressing the problem of invasive species in forest and parks. And to give you an idea of what that problem looks like, there are places within forests, in these parks and all over the region, where you would expect there to be a forest canopy, but somewhere in the middle of that or on the edge of it, there's a large area that's covered in vines. The New York City Parks Natural Resources Group, which started in the middle 80s, many of you may be familiar with it, so I won't go into too great a detail, but they began doing forest restoration work at that time. And I looked at outcomes of that work, of work that started in the late 80s and early 90s. And I went back and looked at that 15 to 20 years after its initial restoration treatments. And some areas had more treatments than others over those many years. The initial treatments involved removing the invasive shrubs and vines and then planting trees in the resulting clearings. There's a better diagram. There it is. So the initial study that I worked on looked at 3 parks where I looked at places that had been restored, and 3 parks where I was able to examine places that had been mapped in the initial work by NRG, and then had not yet then had restoration work done, although many of them now have. So I was able to compare places that have been described as being in similar condition 15 to 20 years prior, but where work had not been done, and measured the plant communities there. We found that there were real differences in forest structure between the restored and the unrestored sites. There were more trees and more tree saplings showing regeneration of trees, in addition to any trees that were planted there by the restoration project, and many fewer stems of vines. Both the species that were removed and then also species that were considered important to remove by that group over time were less abundant in the sites that had been restored. There were really striking differences in the ground layer, which is where those vines are for the most part when they're covering the ground and suppressing tree regeneration completely. They're mostly covering the ground layer and also the shrub layer. So the most striking differences were there. And there were differences in diversity of trees and also in the density of the understory and the ground layer. If anybody wants links to papers and that kind of thing, I'm happy to provide those later. There were also differences in regeneration. And I think one of the interesting things that we found, which I think is just so illustrative of the diverse histories of and the fine scale of heterogeneity in soils in urban environments, is that there was one site where on top of a hill in Prospect Park, where there had been restoration done, but the only trees that were growing from that restoration were sweet gum, which is a tree that you would normally find in poorly drained soils, not on top of a hill. So I was wondering what was going on with the soils there. And after talking with people, eventually I learned from someone who remembered this, that the elephant house of the Prospect Park Zoo used to be up there, and that the soil had been compacted by elephants. So it's important when you're working with plot data and when you're looking at, you're looking at a forest where you really don't know what the history might have been, that there are many possibilities for how things might have gotten that way. So we did, among the trees, shade intolerant species were abundant in all of the sites, which makes sense. These were clearings in the forest canopy. And, conversely to the reduction in non-native species that were undesired, the native species were more abundant. And a major driver of that was that some species, in terms of differences between the sites, in what the plant communities look like, a major driver of that was how often people were able to go back and treat it again. So follow-up is key. I think it's important that even places where there really wasn't, people weren't able to follow up as much, there still were major differences after 15 to 20 years. But those places where more follow-up was possible, had a stronger change in the desired direction, which is probably something that anybody who gardens could tell you. But so let me just catch up here on my other screen. There we are. So I'd like to wrap this up by just thinking about some approaches to conservation and restoration of biodiversity in cities. And obviously I'm coming at things from plant lens because I'm a plant ecologist, but I think it's worthwhile thinking about just the variety of different ways we can approach this. Ecological restoration is, I think, a very useful practice and body of knowledge, as well as the science of restoration ecology. There's been a lot of work done, mainly outside the urban context in this field, to try to restore health and function to ecological systems. And I think there's a lot that can be learned, that can be applied from that body of knowledge and practice in cities. And I think there has been some really nice development in that field and in that community over the last 20 years or so, where there is less of an emphasis on returning something to a state of pristineness, and more on emphasis on, recovery, on, in looking at like what are the components of that. And there's an interesting discussion still to be had about reference systems and how we use places that are in the condition that we would like, and how to apply that in urban environments. But there are a couple. This slide shows some diagrams from the most recent international standards of practice from SER, the Society for Ecological Restoration, and I think both of these are very useful. On the left is the recovery wheel, which is, and you can make your own, where you decide what the variables are that you most want to recover. And you can track progress over time by setting a baseline and looking at how things move. I think that's a very useful tool for thinking about conserving biodiversity in cities and restoring it as well. And then the other diagram here is the restorative continuum, which I also think is a very useful idea, that you can set your goals according to what you think is attainable and possible in a given social context. So setting goals is really one of the big challenges when you're thinking about restoring or enhancing or conserving biodiversity in cities. So is it attainable? Is a goal possible in a changed environment and in the context of the changes that we expect to see? We've got these altered species assemblages and all the interactions that are involved with that. We need to take into account jurisdictions and boundaries. If you remove a whole bunch of Phragmites and immediately on the other side of the fence is the seed source, it's going to create challenges for that work in terms of its long-term sustainability. So we have to take into account the spatial, geographic, and social context. And we can use reference systems to let us know what is missing, perhaps, what is possible, perhaps. And how we choose those references is, I think, also a really interesting and creative opportunity at this point in time. I think it's also really key that we integrate ecological and social goals when thinking about urban biodiversity. There has been research that shows that public participation is really important to the long-term success of ecological restoration in urban environments. So, how to prioritize what to take action on and what actions to take. Transparency can be really key to that, and making sure that people understand what's happening and why, and also making it both obvious and possible for people to perceive benefits or receive benefits from the work that is done to improve biodiversity. At a global scale, that can include livelihoods. So I think the really key thing with approaching conservation and the restoration, enhancement, encouragement of biodiversity in cities is that there are many possible ways, and there are many approaches, and that I think many complementary approaches are needed. There are just a few ideas that I think are helpful. One is the Pigeon paradox, which is the idea that childhood nature experience is super important to people being interested in nature in their life over the long run. And that because most people on Earth now live in cities and towns, pigeons are one of the things that they experience, or that we all experience, really. So with pigeons, I taught high school in New York City for a little while, and one of the things we did was we watched pigeons. They're actually pretty fascinating, but you can learn a lot of biology from a pigeon. I think there's a lot of possibility for learning from the biodiversity that is present in everyday life, and drawing inspiration from that. I mean, you see people celebrating rats and pigeons, you see people taking them on as a mascot, and I think that enthusiasm and that and the just the fascination and the wonder that can be inspired from biodiversity in everyday life is really important. There are benefits of big nature, so it's really important that we conserve the larger spaces that we have. Spaces large enough to get lost in. Even if you would rather not get lost, you want to stay on the trail. But having a place that is large enough for exploration is also really important. Engagement and stewardship, that public participation is really key. And I also really appreciate the work of Joan Nassauer, who one of the threads of her work has really emphasized care as a motivator, as a way to communicate about biodiversity. Her work on showing cues to care as a way to make biodiversity legible to people for whom it otherwise might look messy. So, for example, having what you would call an orderly frame for a messy ecosystem. So mowing the edge of a meadow to show that it's intentional, those kinds of things. So really taking into account that, how people perceive or might perceive work on behalf of biodiversity, and also engaging people in that care and creating opportunities for people to care and to engage in that work of care. So with that, thank you. I hope you've enjoyed the whirlwind tour.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Lea. I think that was really great. And it's really interesting to see, I guess, the different scales of things, looking at plots just in New York City, looking at plots in the, the whole entire bigger region with the, and seeing what differences there are, I guess, in those different scales, but also that there's a lot of the same drivers happening and maybe even the same patterns emerging. So those are very important. We do have.
So I'll stop sharing now.
Oh yeah,
that'd
be it. Great. We have a couple questions in here, and I have some Great. Also. But so from Rebecca McMacken, she says she read a paper a few years ago about how trees near cities were better able to adapt to city life than trees from further south. They were testing climate migration, and she was surprised to see this. She was wondering whether there's you have any comments on that, and the importance of using locally adapted trees in city plantings. I don't know if
So people have been doing some interesting work on that. I think there are a few things in that question, and one is the idea maybe of assisted migration, where people are looking at finding genotypes of native species that are adapted to warmer conditions for use in cities, and also just for use further north in areas that are warming. There's also the interesting fact that cities are warmer than the area around them. So, the trees in urban areas have already been subjected to that warming. So I think there's a very interesting element there to that.
Yeah, and I guess I have heard a little bit about that actually recently, of this potentially sourcing trees from more southern kind of areas with, in anticipation of perhaps that being a better adapted genotype. So I guess it's also one of those things that you can't, even with the best predictions, it's something you can't really know until, it's happening.
Yeah, there's some surprises, I think. We can guess, and we can make good educated guesses about what is going to fare well, but there are many variables, beyond just heat tolerance, for example. I was very surprised by the number of sugar maples that I saw regenerating in some New York City parks. That's a tree that is predicted to decline with climate change, and yet, and who knows if this is a nutrient deposition question instead, but it's something where a species that you might expect to decline is actually regenerating quite well in some areas.
And that's the direction we want to see things in, not something you expect to do well that's going to be doing worse. Another question from Rebecca, looking at those plots of the ones that had been restored versus had not, that some of the species in the unrestored areas were really great natives that seem to not be present in those restored areas, and whether.
Oh, it was not so much that they were removed as those were the species that are we thinking? We're thinking about the restoration study. So those species weren't removed, but they were less dominant, and that might be in some sense an artifact in terms of individual species. So, for example, in some areas of of New York City parks in the 70s and into the 80s, one common use of parks was burning stolen automobiles. Prior to this restoration project, actually, one of the things they addressed in the early years was putting in bollards and other things to keep people from driving cars into the forest and using the forest in that way. So sassafras is a species that resprouts well after fire, and so in some places sassafras can be really, really abundant because it grows a lot of small stems when it resprouts. So those species weren't removed, but they were. I would say that they were species that were able, perhaps due to older rootstock or something, they were able to persist in that environment with the vine cover.
Great. We have another question. Did you look at any of fungi in any of these areas?
I have not. I am a vascular plant nerd, but I think that's a fascinating question. If there are any mycologists who would like to get in on that, I'd love to hear about it.
Another question from Georgia. She says, I'm curious about how elsewhere nature can be reframed as existing in cities, given some of the species and I guess different spaces that do occur in cities, some kind of in the middle between those two extremes.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I think there is even I think about how long it takes on the subway to get to some of the larger parks, and how that feels like going elsewhere too, to some degree, I'm thinking of like moments with friends where somebody turned to me and said, let's go get some nature, like we all went to the park, so I think there's a continuum there too. I think that's a really good point, that there's like the nearby elsewhere and then the far away elsewhere, where we imagine the tropical rainforest, which is not immediately accessible in the Northeast or the Mid-Atlantic region, right? But we can imagine these other biomes as, or we can imagine, further away places that are sort of nearby. But yeah, there is a sort of a nearby elsewhere as well.
Yeah, and I think that's why I know that that's important for some of that to know that there are those kind of wild spaces inside of the city, that I know a lot of my friends from outside of biology kind of are skeptical. So it's good that, to have that to bridge their kind of knowledge about.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me. I mean, I one of my jobs as a grad student was that I taught plant ecology lab at Rutgers. And I would take people who had grown up in New Jersey to places in New Jersey that almost none of them had ever been to, that were amazing. And, we saw all these different habitats. And I think that it's sometimes just the perception that that the nearby is not nature can get in the way of finding it.
All right, and there's another question here from Georgia. I wonder, Georgia, would you mind maybe asking this question? Because I'm not sure, I don't want to like misunderstand kind of what you're asking.
Yes, I can. Let me find it. So I'm curious because sometimes species that are associated with people are spoken of pejoratively, and I'm thinking specifically of the pigeon and the pigeon paradox. And so I'm just curious how we can be more deliberate with our language, because many of the species that we disparage and despise are in human-dominated landscapes because people brought them here intentionally or unintentionally. And I think there's a kind of missing opportunity to talk about the role of humans in shaping non-human dynamics. And when we kind of use this language, we remove the human, the strong human element in these processes. So just curious about your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. Yeah, I think what's interesting about the pigeon paradox, and it's been a while since I read the original paper, but I think the thing with pigeons is that they're so ubiquitous. You know, they're found in human habitats everywhere, and yet they are really important to people's interest in specific places and to the wild species of a whole lot of different parts of the planet, because pigeons are everywhere. But I think that's a really interesting point. I think, yeah, and I think this speaks to like the wonderful weeds ends of things, you know, where species that are perceived to be problematic, right, that would be considered to be weeds in the plant world, and I think it applies to animals as well, pests, right? These are species that are bothersome to people in some way, often due to their abundance, but they are species. They are, you know, they are creatures making a living in the world in the way that they do, and I think that's where I think that that appreciation and wonder can be so powerful, and I think I think it is an important, you know, balance and an interesting conversation to try to have to, you know, on one hand, you know, some people see these species as the wild creatures that they are, and find that fascinating, while others are really turned off. You know, I don't know too many people who would like a rat in their house, but you know, they might like to see one scampering somewhere else. So there are a lot of species that fall in a bit more of a gray zone in terms of how people feel about them. Sparrows, right? Probably somewhere in there, the house sparrow, common yet not as reviled. But yeah, I think it's absolutely a great opportunity to draw attention to the relationships that people have with species. Thinking of a recent book that some of you might enjoy, I believe it was called When Darwin Came to Town, and it's a book that's just full of these stories of evolution of species in urban environments. So maybe we can throw a link to that in later too.
Yeah, great. I mean, and pigeons, from what I, you know, have learned about them, that it's also a matter of the like changing perceptions, because I think probably at, you know, more historically, people didn't see pigeons in the same kind of light. And I've also learned about things like fancy pigeons, that there's these different kind of breeds that have all, you know, that people will have, just like they would have, you know, their prized chickens and with all the different coloration and stuff, that pigeons also have this kind of there. And so, and some of them are really nice looking. So, you know, just kind of about that.
That selective breeding is a big part of why we have different looking pigeons in cities.
Yeah. And I find myself kind of walking around sometimes noting all of those kind of variations within them. We also have a question from one of my fellow PhD students. I see you, if you want to.
Yeah. Hi, this was a super
Hi.
cool talk. It was nice to hear about, like, I don't know, stuff that's going on in where people live. But I'm also really interested to hear more about your career trajectory And maybe if this is not the right forum for that, would it be okay if I reached out by email?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I have had a very wiggly career trajectory following my interests in various directions and getting degrees in different things. So I would be happy to explain this wiggling trajectory. I think it's best explained as follow what fascinates you. And eventually you'll land somewhere where you get paid.
Thanks.
And I just have one more kind of quick question about designation of, I guess at the very beginning of the talk, you mentioned about, percentage of impervious surfaces. And is that kind of a good thing to use as a proxy for like level of urbanization, or is that?
That's also a good question. And actually, the slides that I showed you were from a presentation this past year, and we just recently have completed some new analyses that we're actually finding now that it looks like the amount of canopy cover in that 1 kilometer buffer is perhaps even more important than the amount of impervious surface to tree canopy in particular. Now, to other things about the forest, we're still working on that, but yeah, so there's a lot of discussion about that, and in the world of, you can read lots of papers about this in landscape ecology. Impervious surface is a measure that we have that can be remotely sensed, that is very useful. It generally tends to go along with a number of other measures of urbanization, like population density and road density. It's one of these things that once you start getting into it, is a little tricky to define. What is urbanization exactly? And people use variables like impervious surface to try to, as a sort of a synthetic variable, as a proxy for this very complex process.
Great, and yeah, that remote sensing aspect, I think some things that are able to be remotely sensed are definitely, good way to also do a lot of different sites and a lot of different like areas.
Right, as long as we recognize that all of the data has limitations.
Well, thank you so much again for giving this talk. Actually, I was wondering really quickly if I know, so the reason that we had, this was supposed to be the March talk that we pushed was because at Longwood, they were doing the prescribed burn. I think that's really interesting. If you could briefly maybe tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So we have about 750 acres of natural land surrounding the formal gardens at Longwood, and about, I don't know, a third of that is in meadows. And so we are very fortunate here to be able to use many of the tools in the toolbox that one might want to use for land management. And one of those is fire. We work with all of the regional and local agencies to make that happen. And everyone on my team is a trained wildland firefighter. And we use an external contractor for the burn itself. So we are able to do that. We manage our meadows with both mowing and fire. So in the meadows that we can burn, and we have some that are too close to housing or other things, so we just don't want to put fire next to, or the wind is usually not right next to Route 1. But in the ones that we can burn, we try to burn them on like a about 3-year rotation. So yeah, it's a whole process. Multiple. We plan years in advance and rotate the meadows and mow the fire breaks and wait for the weather to be perfect and have a backup plan. And it's a significant undertaking, but I think it's worth it. I mean, it's really interesting to see the effects of fire. As opposed to mowing, it has different effects on different species, which mowing does too, depending on the species. But depending on the day, it can affect the land a little bit differently, and so you get this sort of a different mosaic effect with fire. It's more patchy, so you have hotter spots and cooler spots, and You know, depending on when you are in spring, if something has greened up a little bit more, it might not burn. And so it creates a little bit more heterogeneity, which the native species seem to like. And we have a number of fire dependent species here that are actually doing pretty well.
So once again, thanks very much. Everybody stay well, and hopefully we'll see you soon.